Evelyn Hart did not scream when the truth settled over her at dawn. She only sat on the edge of the narrow cot, holding the blanket to her chest with both hands, staring at the muddy floor as if the boards might split open and swallow her whole. Across the little lined shack, Cole Mercer stood by the window like a man waiting for a hanging. His knuckles were white against the frame. His jaw was tight enough to crack bone. When he finally turned toward her, the look in his eyes was worse than anger. It was horror. He opened his mouth once, closed it again, then said her name so quietly it sounded like a prayer spoken too late. Evelyn wished he had shouted instead. Silence was crueler. And when he said he would make it right, she understood with a cold, sinking certainty that neither of them would ever belong to the lives they had yesterday. Just the afternoon before, she had still been Samuel Hart's daughter, still moving through the hard, plain rhythm of their homestead outside the Wyoming town of Dry Hollow. She had drawn water from the well, fed the hens, and checked the small garden that fought a losing battle against dry earth and hot wind. At 18, Evelyn knew more about preserving beans and mending shirts than about men. Her parents had raised her on rules as carefully as they had raised corn in poor soil. A woman kept her voice gentle, her eyes lowered, her name clean. Her mother, Ruth, said those things softly. Her father said them like scripture carved in stone. So when Cole Mercer first tipped his hat to her at Turner's Mercantile a week earlier, she had felt heat rush to her cheeks and hated herself for feeling it at all. Everyone in Dry Hollow knew Cole. He was 32, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and rich in the way frontier men rarely were. His cattle spread over miles of open country. His riders moved like a small army. His word carried weight from one rail stop to the next. Women talked about him in careful voices. Men measured themselves against him and usually came up short. Evelyn had heard all of it. He gambled too hard, worked too hard, lived like a man who trusted land and horses more than people. Yet he was also the one who sent feed to a widow after a hard winter and paid a doctor's bill for a ranch hand's child without putting his name on it. That made him more dangerous somehow. A reckless man was easier to fear than a flawed one with a decent streak running through him. Her father saw the danger at once. That night, after the trip to town, he sat with his Bible open on his knee and warned her in the plain voice he used for serious things. Stay away from Mercer. Men who grow rich that fast leave wreckage behind them. Evelyn nodded and kept sewing by the fire while her mother pretended not to notice her trembling fingers. She told herself her father was right. She told herself the way Cole had looked at her meant nothing. Yet over the next few days his face returned to her mind at strange times, while kneading bread, while scrubbing shirts, while lying awake under a thin quilt listening to coyotes sing in the dark. She did not want to think of him, that only made it worse. The second time she saw him, she was alone at the well near sunset, pulling up the last bucket before supper. He rode past on a dark bay horse, then slowed when he spotted her. He did not dismount. He did not crowd her. He only rested one hand on the saddle horn and asked if the heat had taken half her garden yet. Evelyn answered before caution caught up with her. They spoke for less than a minute, nothing improper, nothing a preacher could scold. Still, when he looked at the neat rows of vegetables and said her hands had probably done more honest work than many men he knew, something warm and uncertain stirred inside her. Then he touched the brim of his hat and rode on. She stood there long after the dust settled, angry at herself for watching until he vanished. The storm rolled in the following evening with almost no warning. 1 hour the sky was copper and still. The next it was bruised black from end to end, the wind rising so fast it seemed the whole prairie had drawn one wild breath. Ruth asked for extra kindling before the rain hit. Evelyn went to fetch it from the cottonwood stand near the dry wash, thinking she had time. She had made that walk 100 times, but halfway there the air changed. Leaves turned their pale undersides. Horses in a distant pasture broke into nervous motion. Then thunder struck so hard it felt like a fist against her ribs. By the time she gathered the wood, rain was already slashing sideways through the trees. She tried to run home. Mud caught at her boots. Wind shoved her off balance. Lightning split the dark in white wounds, showing her bits of land she no longer recognized. The wash flooded fast. Branches whipped past her face. More than once she stumbled to her knees and came up soaked, shaking, and half blind. Then she saw a weak lamp glow through the storm. It was not home. She knew that at once. It was one of the cattle-lined shacks men used when the range turned dangerous. Every lesson her parents had ever taught her told her to stay away. But the storm had stripped the world down to fear and survival. She pushed through the door anyway, clutching wet wood to her chest like something foolish and useless. Cole Mercer was inside. He rose so quickly his chair tipped backward. Papers were spread across the table. A bottle sat open near one elbow. His shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, sleeves rolled, hair damp from whatever trip had brought him there ahead of the storm. For one long second they only stared at each other. Then common sense returned to him before it returned to her. He took the wood from her arms, threw it aside, and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. His hands were steady. His voice was not. He asked what she was doing out in weather fit to kill cattle. She tried to answer and could barely get the words out through her chattering teeth. He fed the stove until the little room glowed red, then told her she would have to change out of her wet clothes or she would be dead by morning. Shame burned hotter than the fire, but another shiver bent her nearly double, and she knew he was right. There was a canvas sheet hanging in one corner. He handed her a dry shirt and trousers and turned his back while she changed. Even then her hands shook so badly she could hardly manage the buttons. When she stepped out, lost inside his oversized clothes, he had already spread her dress near the stove to dry and moved to the far end of the room. He poured a little whiskey into a tin cup and told her to drink. She refused at first. He told her this was one of the rare moments in life when pride was a poor idea. The liquor burned all the way down, made her cough, then filled her with unsteady warmth. Outside, the storm battered the shack without mercy. Inside, the silence between them was almost worse. She sat near the fire on a wooden crate while he pretended to study his ledgers, though she could feel his eyes lifting to check on her every few minutes. Hours passed. Rain hammered the roof. Wind rattled the walls. Evelyn fought sleep because sleep felt dangerous, because nothing about the night could be called proper, because she was a young woman alone with a man her father had warned her against. But fear, cold, and the whiskey dragged at her. At last Cole stood, crossed the room slowly, and told her she could take the cot. He would stay in the chair and keep watch. Something in his face convinced her, not softness exactly. Weariness, maybe. A kind of rough honor she had not expected. Too tired to argue, she lay down fully dressed beneath the blanket and watched him return to the table. The firelight caught one side of his face and left the other in shadow. That was the last clear thing she remembered before sleep and storm blurred the edges of everything. Now morning had come and clarity had brought no mercy. The storm was gone. In its place stood wet light, silence, and the ruin of 2 lives. Cole spoke first. He said there had been whiskey in him and darkness in the room, and a woman he had expected before the weather broke. He said none of that mattered because the fault was his and his alone. Evelyn listened without raising her eyes. When she finally whispered that she had stayed still because terror had frozen her where she lay, he shut his eyes like the words were a knife. Then he said he would ride her home himself, stand before her father, and ask for marriage before the sun set. Evelyn looked at him then. She did not see the bold ranch King Dry Hollow talked about. She saw a man sick with guilt, trying to build honor from wreckage. It did not comfort her, but it did make her believe he would do exactly what he said. The ride back to the Hart homestead felt like crossing a graveyard. She sat in front of him on the saddle, stiff as dry wood, his coat around her shoulders though the morning had turned warm. Her parents were waiting in the yard when they came over the last rise. Ruth ran first. Samuel did not move. He stood like an iron post, taking in Evelyn's face, the borrowed coat, the horse, the man behind her. No daughter needed to explain much to a father in a place like Wyoming. Cole asked for a private word. Samuel led him toward the barn without a sound. From the porch, Evelyn heard the dull thud of a fist, then another. Cole did not strike back. When the men returned, blood marked her father's knuckles and darkened the corner of Cole's mouth. Samuel looked older than he had the day before. He said there would be a wedding on Saturday. Small, quiet, final. Evelyn stood in the yard while the prairie wind tugged at her dress and understood that girlhood had ended not in joy, not even in love, but in a storm and a sentence she could not escape. The wedding passed like a bad dream Evelyn could not wake from. By the time the traveling preacher stood in the Hart yard on Saturday morning, the whole business had already hardened into something grim and unavoidable. Her mother had taken in Ruth's old wedding dress at the waist and hemmed the sleeves by lamplight the night before. It fit well enough, though the lace at the collar had yellowed with age and the fabric smelled faintly of cedar from years in the trunk. Evelyn wore it because there was nothing else to wear. She stood beside Cole Mercer beneath a white sky that promised heat by noon, listening to words about duty and devotion while her father stared straight ahead as if he were attending a burial. Her mother cried quietly into a handkerchief. Cole spoke his vows in a low, steady voice that never once faltered. Evelyn said hers the same way a person might answer to a judge. When it was done, no one cheered. No one smiled much. The preacher closed his Bible. The marriage was finished. The damage had simply taken a new shape. Cole did not try to touch her on the ride to his ranch. He helped her into the wagon because her mother insisted it would look more proper than riding double on horseback. Then he sat across from her on the bench, reins in hand, giving her all the space the narrow seat allowed. The wagon wheels creaked over the dry road while summer wind combed through the grass on either side. Evelyn kept her hands folded tightly in her lap and watched the land slide by. The Mercer spread was larger than anything she had imagined. Fences ran out toward the horizon. Windmills turned in the distance. Riders moved like small dark marks against the bright earth. It was a place built by money and force of will. She felt small even before they reached the house. The ranch house stood on a low rise above a cottonwood draw, wider and finer than any home she had ever entered. Its porch wrapped around two sides. The windows were real glass, not the wavy panes common in town. Inside, there were polished floors, proper curtains, and furniture that matched. Evelyn paused in the entry as one of the housemaids stepped forward to take her bag. The girl was near her own age and looked at her with a quick, curious kindness that somehow made everything worse. Evelyn had grown up in a home where every object had been earned twice, once with labor and once with care. Here, comfort seemed to grow naturally out of the walls. It unsettled her. Cole noticed. He told the staff she was Mrs. Mercer now and that anything she needed would be provided without question. His tone was calm, controlled, almost formal. Then he led her down the hallway and opened a bedroom door. It was not his room. She understood that immediately. The bed was smaller than the one in the master chamber she had glimpsed at the far end of the hall. The wallpaper was pale green. A washstand stood beneath the window. Fresh flowers had been placed on the dresser, probably by a maid who believed she was doing something kind. Cole kept one hand on the doorknob and did not step inside. "This room is yours," he said. "My room is at the end of the hall. You'll not be troubled here." Evelyn looked at him then. Since the morning after the storm, she had hardly done that. There was a bruise along his jaw where her father had struck him. He looked exhausted, as though the last week had cost him more sleep than a cattle drive. Yet he stood there like a man trying to hold a crumbling wall upright with his bare hands. "You don't have to explain," she said, because the sight of his careful distance did more than any promise could have. His face tightened. "I do, though. I will not come into your room unless you ask it. I will not lay a hand on you without permission. This house is yours to move through as you please. No one here will speak to you with disrespect. If they do, they answer to me." It was the longest speech he had made to her since the wedding. She nodded once. He dipped his head and walked away, boots quiet on the polished floor. The first days settled into an uneasy pattern. Cole rose before dawn and worked until dark. Evelyn learned the house by walking it in careful silence, as if she were a guest who had overstayed and feared breaking something. The cook, Mrs. Porter, was stout and practical, with flour always on her apron and opinions about everything from preserves to politics. The housemaid, Lily, showed Evelyn where linens were kept and how the big iron stove behaved when the wind shifted. The foreman, Wade Collins, touched his hat whenever he saw her and never let surprise show in his face, though she could tell the marriage had been discussed in every bunkhouse within 50 miles. Everyone was polite. Politeness could feel like pity in a prettier dress. Meals were the hardest. At first Cole arranged for a tray to be sent to her room, and she accepted out of relief. But on the fourth evening, Mrs. Porter planted her hands on her hips and announced that no marriage ever improved with two people hiding from the same table. Evelyn almost refused. Then pride stiffened her spine. She came down to the dining room wearing a plain blue dress and found Cole already seated at one end, his napkin untouched, as though he had been waiting without eating. He rose when she entered. That gesture alone told her more about him than all the stories she had heard in Dry Hollow. They ate roast chicken, beans, and buttered bread. The clink of silver sounded loud in the quiet room. Cole asked if the potatoes had too much salt. Evelyn said they were fine. He asked if the room given her was comfortable. She said yes. A lesser man might have forced conversation to fill the silence. Cole did not. He seemed to understand that quiet could be mercy. By the end of the meal, the air between them felt less raw, not soft, not easy, just less sharp. A week later, Evelyn asked if there was a place she might keep a small kitchen garden. The question seemed to surprise him more than if she had asked for diamonds. A garden, he repeated. I know this soil is poor, she said, but there's a patch near the south fence with decent morning light. If water can be spared, I could make something of it. For the first time since the storm, she saw something like life stir behind his weary eyes. He took her outside the next morning before the heat rose and walked the ground with her. They stood side by side studying dirt, shade, and water runoff like two farmers arguing over weather. He listened when she spoke, truly listened. By noon he had ordered a hand to bring fencing, another to haul composted manure, and a third to repair the nearest irrigation ditch. Evelyn had expected indulgence. What she got was respect. That small patch of earth became her first real foothold in the Mercer place. She worked there in the mornings with a straw hat tied beneath her chin and dust on her hands. The men passed and nodded. Lily brought her cool water. Mrs. Porter grumbled that no lady of the house should be kneeling in dirt, then quietly sent out cucumber starts saved from spring. When Cole rode in from the range, he often paused by the fence to ask how the beans were taking. Sometimes she answered with more than a sentence before she remembered herself. Their first true conversation came because of rain that never arrived. Clouds had gathered at dusk and drifted away without a drop. Evelyn was on the porch after supper watching lightning far off on the horizon. Cole stepped out beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed one over without asking whether she wanted it. She took it because the night felt too tired for formal refusals. We need rain, she said. We need 3 days of it, he answered. They watched the dry storm flicker in silence. Then he said, when I was 14, Missouri went dry for 1 whole summer. My mother boiled the same bones 3 times to stretch broth. Evelyn turned to him. It was the first thing he had offered from his own life. My father never spoke of hunger, she said, but my mother did. She said want makes people hard if they let it. Cole gave a short, humorless smile. Then I suppose I let it a little. The words settled between them. Not apology, not confession, something plainer and more honest. Evelyn held the cup in both hands and felt for the first time that the stranger she had married was not made entirely of power and regret. There was old hurt in him, old fear. She did not know what to do with that knowledge, only that it complicated her anger in ways she had not asked for. By the 3rd week, the house no longer felt like a hotel room built for someone else. She still missed her mother's voice, her father's rough cough in the mornings, even the uneven floorboards of the Hart place. But she had learned which stair creaked, where the afternoon sun fell warmest, and how the ranch quieted after dark when the men were fed and the horses settled. She had also learned that Cole never once entered her room, never once stood too near in a doorway, never once tried to purchase forgiveness with gifts or charm. He gave her safety, order, and room to breathe. She did not trust him yet. Perhaps she never fully would, but she had begun to trust the boundaries he kept. Then one morning, while washing at the basin before breakfast, a sharp wave of sickness rose so suddenly that she barely reached the pitcher stand in time. When it passed, she stayed bent over, gripping the wood and staring at her own pale face in the small mirror. For several days she had been tired in a way sleep could not cure. Smells had turned strange. Bread 1 hour smelled heavenly and the next made her stomach churn. A quiet dread had been growing at the edge of her mind, one she had refused to name. Now she named it. She pressed both hands to the basin and closed her eyes. The room felt terribly still. Outside, she could hear wagons rattling toward the corrals and one of the ranch dogs barking. Somewhere in the house, normal life continued. But for Evelyn, the world had just tilted again. The storm had not finished with her after all. It had merely left one final reckoning behind, waiting its hour. Evelyn kept the knowledge to herself for 2 full days. She moved through the house like a woman carrying a secret ember in her palms, careful not to let anyone see the heat. Morning sickness struck without warning. One moment she would be standing at the kitchen table helping Mrs. Porter snap beans, and the next she would have to set the bowl down and breathe through a hard wave of nausea. She blamed the heat once. Then she blamed spoiled milk. By the second evening, even she could no longer pretend. The signs were too plain. Her body had begun to speak in a language older than words, and she understood every part of it. She told no one because saying it aloud would make it real in a way thought alone could not. She lay awake that night listening to the dry wind stroke the side of the house and stared into the darkness with both hands folded over her stomach. A child, his child, her child, a living piece of that terrible night growing quietly beneath her heart. The thought brought fear first, sharp and cold. Then came shame because the town would count backward. The women at Turner's Mercantile would lower their voices only enough to make sure she still heard them. Her father would know the wedding had not come soon enough to hide the truth. And Cole, bound to her already by guilt, would now be bound by blood as well. She did not know whether that thought hurt more than the others. On the third morning, the smell of frying bacon sent her rushing from the kitchen before she could stop herself. She barely made it to the porch steps. When the sickness passed, she stayed there crouched in the early light, one hand gripping the rail. Boots sounded behind her. She knew before she turned who it was. Cole never stomped like the hired men did. He moved with quiet purpose, even in work boots. He stopped a few feet away. "Evelyn, are you ill?" She wanted to say no. The word rose and died. There was no use in lying now. She pushed herself upright slowly, keeping one hand on the rail because her knees felt unsteady. "I believe I'm with child," she said. The morning seemed to go still around them. Even the wind dropped for one strange second. Cole did not speak. His face changed in small, hard ways. First shock, then something darker, something like grief. He took off his hat and held it in both hands as though he needed something solid to keep from losing balance. "Are you certain?" he asked at last. "Yes." He looked out over the corrals instead of at her. Men were already at work in the distance, too far away to hear, thank God. When he finally drew a breath, it sounded rough. "I'll send for the doctor." "There's no need just yet." "There is every need." He turned then, and the force of feeling in his face made her catch her breath. "If there is even the slightest chance you're unwell, I want Warren here today." "I'm not sick," she said more softly. "Not in that way." His eyes closed briefly. "No, I suppose not." For a long moment neither moved. Then he said the one thing she had not expected. "Do you wish this child?" The question struck her harder than if he had asked whether she blamed him. She pressed a hand over her middle, though there was nothing yet to feel beneath the flatness of her dress. "I don't know what I wish," she admitted. "I only know it is there." Cole nodded once slowly, as if he understood more than her words held. "Then that is enough for now." Dr. Warren came that afternoon anyway. He was a spare man with silver at his temples and kind eyes sharpened by frontier experience. He examined Evelyn in the downstairs parlor because Mrs. Porter declared no young wife in a delicate state should be climbing stairs for a doctor's convenience. When he finished, he smiled in a quiet, professional way, and said what Evelyn already knew. She was indeed carrying a child, still early, healthy by all signs. He gave instructions about food, rest, and avoiding too much summer heat, then rose to take his leave. Cole walked him to the porch. Evelyn was not close enough to hear every word, but she heard enough. Cole asked if there was danger. The doctor said there was always danger with childbirth, but no reason yet to fear the worst. Cole asked what she should eat, how much she should walk, what symptoms would trouble a prudent man. By the time Warren rode away, Evelyn had the strange impression that Cole had learned more in 10 minutes about pregnancy than some husbands learned in 10 years. The house changed after that, though no one said so directly. Mrs. Porter began adding broths and stewed fruit to Evelyn's meals. Lily fussed over drafts and opened windows. Wade Collins sent over a gentler mare when he learned Evelyn's old horse had become too quick-footed for comfort. And Cole looked at her differently. Not like a lover, not even quite like a husband. More like a man standing guard over something precious and breakable in the same breath. That new attention unsettled her at first. If she carried a basket that seemed too heavy, it vanished from her hands before she reached the kitchen. If she stood too long in the noon sun, Cole appeared from nowhere to suggest shade in a voice so careful it nearly made her angry. One evening she snapped that she was carrying a child, not made of spun sugar. He took the rebuke without offense. "I know that," he said. "But if anything happened to you—" He stopped there, the unfinished sentence hung between them. "To the baby, you mean," she said, his jaw tightened. "To either of you." That answer stayed with her longer than she liked. As summer deepened, the ranch faced problems that had nothing to do with babies or marriage. Water ran lower than it should have. Grass on the North Range crisped early. Then word came that the Talbot gang had been seen along Bitter Creek, scouting stock and water rights the way wolves tested a fence line before a kill. Every rancher in the district knew the name. The Talbots stole cattle, yes, but they also burned hay stores and shot men who tried to stop them. Cole and Wade spent long evenings bent over maps in the study. Riders came and went at odd hours. Rifles were cleaned more often. Horses were saddled before dawn and left ready through supper. Evelyn heard enough to understand the danger. One night she found Cole alone on the back porch after the house had gone quiet. He sat in shirt sleeves with a ledger open on his knee, though he clearly had not been reading it. The lamp beside him cast a small circle of gold around his hands. "You think they'll come here," she said. He did not pretend not to understand. "If they do, it will be for water, not money. Men can live without money longer than cattle can live without a creek." Evelyn looked out into the dark yard. "Then you should post men at the lower spring. That's where I would come from if I wanted to test your defenses." Cole turned toward her, surprise plain on his face. "Why there?" "Because the ridge hides movement and the cottonwoods mask sound. Also because the men on horseback all watch the main trail first. My father taught me that much. He said trouble rarely enters by the road it announces." For the first time in days, something close to a real expression moved through Cole's face. Not grief or duty, respect. "You're right," he said. "I'd been looking at the draw too broadly." The next morning he sent 2 men to the lower spring. After that, he began asking her opinion more often. At first it was on small things. Whether the smokehouse sat too close to the kitchen in dry weather. Whether Mrs. Porter was right that more root vegetables should be laid in before autumn. Then came larger matters. Which homestead wife in the district could be trusted to organize supplies if the ranchers formed a mutual watch? Whether a wagon route through the east pasture would turn muddy in winter. Evelyn answered carefully, aware each time that he listened as though her thoughts mattered. No one had treated her that way before except her mother in private moments over sewing or canning jars. It stirred something in her that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with being seen. One evening near the end of August, she was mending a torn shirt in the sitting room when a sharp flutter brushed low in her belly. She froze. It came again, lighter than a bird's wing, gone almost before she could be sure. Her hand moved to her stomach on its own. Tears filled her eyes so suddenly it startled her, not from fear this time, from wonder. Cole came in a few minutes later, dust still on his boots from the yard. He stopped when he saw her face. "What is it?" She laughed once through tears she could not quite stop. "I think the baby moved." He stood absolutely still. "Did it?" "Yes, only a little." He took one step closer, then halted as though some invisible line still stood between them. "May I?" Evelyn looked down at her hands, then back at him. Slowly, she nodded. He crossed the room with more care than she had ever seen a large man use. Kneeling beside her chair, he placed his hand where she guided it. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then the tiny flutter came again. Cole's whole face changed. Every hard line in it seemed to loosen at once. Wonder, pure and unguarded, broke through the weariness he had worn for months. "Our child," he said quietly. The words should have felt like obligation. They did not. Not in that moment. In that moment they sounded like awe. Then from somewhere outside came the crack of a rifle shot. Cole was on his feet at once, hand going for the revolver he still wore from the yard. Voices shouted near the corrals. Evelyn rose too quickly, one palm still pressed protectively to her stomach. "Stay here," he said. "I won't hide in my own house." His eyes flashed to hers. For one hard second she thought he would argue. Then he gave a short nod. "Then stay by the window and away from the line of fire." He was gone before she could answer, moving through the doorway with the speed of a man long used to danger. Evelyn stood alone in the suddenly silent room, heart thudding, hand over the place where her child had just spoken to her for the first time. Outside, boots pounded, men shouted, and somewhere in the dark yard a horse screamed. Whatever had begun between her and Cole Mercer was no longer only guilt or duty or the wreckage of one storm-lost night. Something else had taken root. Something more dangerous, perhaps, because it offered hope. The next few days blurred by in the tense, dry heat of late summer. The Talbot gang had not been spotted again, but their shadows still loomed over every part of ranch life. Cole's men doubled their watch, and every evening Cole would sit on the porch, staring at the wide, empty horizon as though he could force the danger to show itself through sheer will. Evelyn noticed how he looked less like the hard man of business and more like a man waiting for an inevitable strike. And yet, through it all, there was a strange shift between them. With each day, Cole seemed to shed the formal distance that had once separated them, like layers of his own defenses. He spoke to her more freely, asking for her thoughts, including her in small decisions around the ranch. He still worked harder than anyone, his presence a constant in the barn, the fields, the dry creek bed where he had his men dig for water sources. Yet his eyes followed her more often, as though searching for something in her face. Sometimes, when she passed by the study, she would find him sitting at the desk, the ledger open before him, but his gaze miles away. On the fourth morning after the rifle shot, Evelyn found him in the kitchen peeling potatoes for stew. The moment was so ordinary that it startled her. She had never imagined seeing him in such an intimate, domestic setting, his broad hands working a task she would have done herself. Yet there he was, focused on the rhythm of it like anyone else who understood the quiet value of small acts. "Good morning," she said softly, stepping into the room. Cole looked up from the potatoes, his eyes softening in a way that made Evelyn pause. "Morning." His voice was quieter, like he hadn't expected her to speak first. "I didn't mean to startle you with the stew. You'll be helping Mrs. Porter when she gets in from the barn, but I thought I'd start it." There was something about the way he said it with that rare, almost embarrassed edge to his tone that made Evelyn smile despite the weight of the world pressing in around them. "I wasn't startled," she said, moving closer. She had not realized how used to the space she had become until she reached for a cloth to wipe down the counter without thinking. They moved around each other like two strangers still learning the shape of the same house, careful, respectful, but tethered by necessity and something deeper that neither of them could quite name. "How's the garden coming along?" he asked, his question light but sincere. "Well enough," Evelyn replied, feeling the warmth of pride spread through her chest. She had learned to garden in the harshest conditions, and there was something deeply satisfying about seeing her plants survive against all odds. The tomatoes should be ready soon. They just need a little more sunlight. He nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drifting to the window where the early light filtered through the thick oak trees. "You've made this place your own, Evelyn. I haven't told you that enough." Evelyn didn't know how to respond. No one had ever said such a thing to her, not in a way that meant more than polite acknowledgement. "It's not mine, Cole, it's yours. You built this place." "It's ours now," he corrected her quietly, almost absently. "I said it before and I'll say it again. This is our home, Evelyn. You're as much a part of it as I am." Her heart skipped a beat at the sincerity in his words, though part of her still pulled back, uncertain of how to respond to such honesty. They were still bound by the sharp edges of their circumstances, a marriage made of duty rather than choice. Yet over the past weeks, something between them had softened, slowly, carefully. The baby moved again. Evelyn's hand instinctively went to her belly. It was a small movement, barely noticeable unless she was paying close attention, but it sent warmth flooding through her chest. Cole looked at her, watching her hand move to her stomach. His expression, always so guarded, softened for a brief second, and for the first time in weeks, Evelyn saw not guilt or obligation but a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Has she been moving much?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Yes," Evelyn replied, her voice quieter. She smiled slightly, a private smile that she only shared with her growing child. "Just a little here and there." Cole's expression was unreadable, but she noticed the way his gaze lingered, the way his hand flexed at his side as though he wanted to reach out but didn't know how. The tension that had always existed between them, thick like a curtain, was no longer a constant. Instead, it hung there like a question, unasked, unanswered, but shared. "You're going to be a good mother," he said finally, as if testing the words, as if he wasn't entirely sure what they meant, but felt they were the truth nonetheless. Evelyn blinked, surprised by the quiet certainty in his voice. She had never seen herself as a mother, not before, not in the way he spoke. But now, with Cole's steady gaze on her, she wondered if that was changing, if she could, if she would become someone who could raise a child in this place with this man. "Thank you," she whispered. A shadow passed over Cole's face then, a fleeting moment of something darker, a weight she had seen only when he thought she wasn't looking. Before she could ask about it, the door opened and Mrs. Porter came bustling in, followed by Lily, both carrying baskets full of eggs and milk from the barn. Cole stepped back quickly, but Evelyn saw the lingering tension in his shoulders as he moved aside. He didn't speak as Mrs. Porter clucked about breakfast and the day's chores, but Evelyn knew he was still there, still with her in the quiet way he had become a part of her life. The next few days passed without incident, the Talbot threat fading into the background as it became clear the gang was moving toward other ranches. For a brief time, the world felt manageable again. Evelyn worked alongside the staff, planting and gathering, cooking meals, and caring for the small patch of earth she had cultivated. She and Cole shared moments of quiet collaboration, no words needed, only action speaking louder than anything else could. At times, they even exchanged small jokes, laughing over the smallest things as if the weight of the past hadn't happened at all. But those were fleeting moments, still tender and fragile, built on the foundation of necessity, not yet trust. But then the day came when Cole left again to handle business further out in the territory, and Evelyn found herself standing in the barn alone, looking out across the wide open land she had slowly come to know. The silence of it all was heavy. The land stretched out, vast and unforgiving. The wind whispered through the dried grass like a warning, and the morning sun poured down with the kind of heat that made everything shimmer at the edges. The house felt empty without Cole's quiet presence, and for the first time since their wedding, Evelyn realized just how far they had both come from the storm that had first tied them together. And yet, something inside her whispered that there was more than she could see, more than she could touch. A future, perhaps, that had not been written in the dark moments, but in the quiet steps they had taken together. Evelyn did not know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She had crossed too many miles of earth and heart to turn back now. Whatever had begun between her and Cole Mercer, whatever had changed over the past few weeks, was real, and it was something she would fight for, just as she fought for everything else in this hard, unforgiving land. When Cole returned the next evening, exhausted and covered in dust, Evelyn did not wait for him to speak. She crossed the room to him, meeting him in the doorway with no words between them. For a moment they simply stood there looking at each other, the world outside continuing its endless march forward. And then, with a quiet certainty, Cole spoke the words that she had known would come even before he said them. "We'll make this work, Evelyn. We'll make a life here, together." The next few weeks brought with them an uncomfortable kind of peace. Evelyn had stopped questioning the direction her life was taking, for there was no point in pretending that she could change what had already been done. The child grew inside her, slow and steady, and with each passing day, the ranch began to feel more like a place where she belonged rather than a place she had been forced into. There were moments when she could almost forget the sharp edges of their beginning, moments when she would laugh with Mrs. Porter over a meal or find herself in the garden, speaking softly to the plants she had nurtured. But those moments were fleeting. Beneath them lingered the uncertainty of her marriage, the whispered rumors from town, and the ever-present knowledge that she had been married to Cole Mercer not because of love, but because of guilt, obligation, and the deep-seated need to make things right. There was no magic in their union, no spark that she had hoped would ignite between them. Still, as the days stretched on, she found herself learning to read him, to see the quiet things he didn't say. Cole had grown into a quieter, more reflective man in the wake of their wedding. She saw the way his shoulders sagged at night, the way his gaze would turn distant when he thought no one was watching. He never spoke of the past, of the night that had bound them together, but she could feel it in the weight of his silence. He had made the mistake, but she knew now that it had broken him more than she had realized at first. His guilt had become a quiet companion, something that lingered in his every movement, his every word. Still, he kept his distance in a way that made her wonder if he truly saw her as anything more than the woman he had wronged. She was his wife now, but she was also the consequence of a mistake he would never be able to undo. The evenings when they ate dinner together were the hardest. They sat across from each other in the grand dining room, the silence between them thick and heavy, punctuated only by the clink of silverware and the occasional murmured comment. Evelyn could feel the tension in the air, could feel it in the way Cole's eyes would sometimes flick to her, as though searching for something he couldn't quite find. The house, though grand and comfortable, still felt empty when the two of them shared a meal. The walls seemed to echo their isolation. It wasn't until one evening in late September, as the last vestiges of summer heat began to wane, that things shifted, just slightly, but enough for Evelyn to feel the change. She had spent most of the afternoon in the garden, pulling weeds from the vegetable patch, the rhythmic motion of her hands keeping her mind occupied. When she returned to the house, tired but content, she found Cole sitting on the porch with a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out across the wide plains as the sun dipped below the horizon. He didn't hear her approach. She stopped at the edge of the porch and simply watched him for a moment, the weight of his solitude pressing against her heart. It was as though he was always a step away from something, as though the world he had built had not yet managed to settle inside him. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly, stepping up to the porch steps. He turned at the sound of her voice, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She stood just a few feet away from him, unsure of whether she should close the distance between them or remain where she was. "I've been thinking," he said at last, his voice rough from the weight of unspoken things, "about everything, about how this all came to be." Evelyn hesitated, then sat beside him on the porch swing. "I suppose I've been thinking the same." "Have you?" he asked, his voice tightening slightly. "What about?" She looked out at the land in front of them, the golden light of dusk spreading across the prairie. "About what's real," she said softly. "About how we've managed to make this arrangement work. I don't know if it's enough, but I think it's the best we can do. We're here, Cole, and we're both trying to make something of it, whether we like it or not." He exhaled slowly, then took another sip from his glass. "I don't know how to make things right," he said, almost to himself. "I keep thinking that if I work harder, do more, maybe I'll find a way to atone for what I've done." Evelyn didn't respond at first. She simply watched the way the light shifted in his eyes, the way his hands tightened around the glass, as if he were holding onto something that might slip away. "You don't have to keep atoning, Cole," she said after a long pause. "You've done everything you can, more than most men would. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything. You don't." His gaze shifted to her, searching her face. "What do you want from me then?" His voice was low, filled with a quiet desperation she hadn't expected. "What do you want me to be?" The question hung in the air between them like a rope that could pull them closer or tear them apart. Evelyn's heart ached at the weight of it. She hadn't known what she had expected, what she had wanted from him, but in that moment she realized something. They both were asking the wrong questions. "I want you to be real," she said softly, meeting his eyes. "I want us to be real, no more pretending, no more silence, no more guilt weighing us down. I want us to be what we can be together, not because we have to be, but because we want to be. And if that's not enough for you, then I don't know what is." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Cole set down his glass and looked at her with an intensity she had not seen before. Something in his face shifted, as though he were seeing her for the first time, not as the woman he had married out of obligation, but as the person she had become. A woman with strength, a woman with a quiet power. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers for the first time in months. "I've been so damn afraid of what I've done to you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't think you would ever forgive me, but I see now. We've both been living in the past." Evelyn's chest tightened at his words, but she didn't pull away. She squeezed his hand gently, allowing him the closeness he had been afraid to seek. "I'm not asking you to forget Cole," she said softly, "but maybe we can start moving forward together in whatever way that looks like." His eyes softened, and for the first time she saw the flicker of something that had been buried beneath his guilt and pride, something that could be called hope. "I'll try," he said quietly. "For you, for us." The evening settled around them as they sat together on the porch, the air cooling and the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. For the first time since their wedding, Evelyn felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a small, tentative step toward something new. Later that night, after the house had quieted and the lights dimmed, Evelyn found herself standing in front of the mirror, brushing her hair in the soft glow of a kerosene lamp. The reflection staring back at her seemed different somehow, stronger, more resilient. She had never expected this life, never asked for it. But as her hand rested gently on her growing belly, she felt something stir within her. Not the fear she had lived with in the early days of her marriage, but a quiet acceptance. Whatever came next, whatever the world threw their way, she would face it. Not as the frightened girl who had been swept into this life, but as a woman who had built something real out of the ashes of a mistake. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The days stretched into weeks, and Evelyn began to feel a rhythm settling into the work of their lives. The mornings were marked by the quiet hum of daily tasks, the barn filling with the noise of men and horses preparing for another long day, the kitchen bustling with the smell of fresh bread and coffee. By afternoon, the sun was already heavy in the sky, baking the earth in a heat that seemed to drain every ounce of energy from the land. But it wasn't just the ranch that had settled. There was something about the air itself that seemed to change. The awkwardness between her and Cole had begun to shift, a gradual easing of the tension that had once hovered like a thick fog between them. It started with small things. When Cole would return from the range, instead of retreating into the study or the barn, he would sometimes sit beside her at the table, silent but present. Sometimes he would share something, a story from the cattle drive, a memory from when he was younger, a moment of humor that Evelyn had never thought him capable of. The first time he shared something that made her laugh, a real laugh, not one she forced, the sound seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. She had never expected that Cole Mercer could make her laugh, not in the way that she had once imagined love might make her laugh, but there it was, and it was enough for that moment. The evenings were spent in a similar quiet. No longer did they sit at opposite ends of the room, consumed by the weight of words unspoken. Instead, they shared the space with an ease that came from not needing to fill every silence. Sometimes they worked side by side, Evelyn in the kitchen, Cole tending to his business dealings and ranch duties, both of them moving with purpose but with the kind of comfort that only comes from familiarity. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something else. A partnership that was growing, formed not out of a quick decision but out of necessity, respect, and time. It was on one of those quiet evenings, as Cole sat in the study, going over ledgers and making notes about the next shipment of cattle, that the conversation between them finally shifted into something deeper. Evelyn had been folding clothes in the adjoining room when she heard the soft rustle of papers, and then the sound of Cole's voice, calm and steady, calling her name. "Evelyn, come here for a minute." She stood, wiping her hands on her apron as she crossed the threshold. Cole looked up from the papers, his face shadowed by the dim light from the oil lamp on the desk. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice soft. He nodded, but there was something in the way he was looking at her that made her pause. His eyes, usually guarded, seemed to carry a heaviness tonight. He set the papers aside and leaned back in the chair, his expression more thoughtful than usual. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low, "about the future, about what we're building here." Evelyn felt a flutter in her chest at the mention of the future. She hadn't expected it to come up, not in this way, not after everything that had happened. "What do you mean?" she asked, stepping closer, her gaze steady on his face. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that had become all too familiar to her. "I've been thinking about the ranch, about the land, about everything we've gone through, and I've realized something." He looked up at her, his gaze unwavering. "This is yours, too. Not just the ranch, not just the house. You've built as much of this life as I have, Evelyn. I don't want you to ever feel like you're just here because of me. You're as much a part of this as I am." For a moment, Evelyn couldn't breathe. The weight of his words settled over her, and she struggled to find the right response. She had always known that she was part of the ranch in some small way, but hearing it from Cole, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, made her realize just how far they had come. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd hear you say that." But Cole smiled faintly, and for the first time in weeks, Evelyn saw a spark of warmth in his eyes, a gentleness that hadn't been there before. "It's the truth, and I owe you more than words can say." He rose from his chair slowly, as if the moment required a pause. Then he walked over to where she stood and placed his hands on her shoulders, his touch steady and grounding. "I know we didn't start this the way anyone would have chosen, but that doesn't mean we can't make something real out of it." Evelyn's heart swelled at the words, but she didn't speak. Instead, she just nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. She didn't know what the future would hold, or whether love would ever truly blossom between them. But for the first time, she felt that they were walking down the same path, side by side, not out of obligation but because they had both chosen to be there. As the days passed, Cole's presence in the house became a constant, no longer a man burdened by guilt but one who had begun to find his place alongside her. Their conversations grew more frequent, their silences more comfortable. She helped him with the business of the ranch, offering her insights into the practicalities of running the place, and he listened, truly listened, to her ideas and suggestions. They shared moments that felt like they could be the beginning of something deeper, something neither of them had dared to imagine at first. And then came the day when Evelyn realized just how much had changed. She had been sitting outside, resting under the shade of the oak tree when she felt it, the familiar flutter inside her stomach. It was becoming stronger now, more pronounced, and for the first time Evelyn didn't feel afraid of it. She didn't feel afraid of the future or of what might come next. Cole appeared beside her as though he had sensed her thoughts. He crouched down beside her and placed his hand over her belly, his touch gentle, almost reverent. "She's kicking again, isn't she?" he said softly. Evelyn smiled, nodding. Yes, it's strange, but I think she knows we're here together. Cole's lips curved into a smile, a rare, unguarded smile that softened the lines of his face. I think she does, he agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment they simply sat there, the world quiet around them, the land stretching out before them, endless and full of possibility. Evelyn's hand rested on Cole's, and for the first time she felt the quiet strength of something growing between them, not love yet, not fully, but respect, partnership, and perhaps the beginning of something more. Cole's voice broke the silence. You know, Evelyn, will be fine. The baby, you me, will make it work. Evelyn's heart swelled with emotion, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, a soft laugh escaping her lips. I believe you. They sat in the fading light of the evening, neither speaking, but both knowing that the journey ahead was not one they would walk alone.